December 7th, it was out there. We were living in Baguio, which is the summer capital of the Philippines. It's north of Manila, up in the mountains, and very cool. It's also, we were a number of gold mines, and my father was an accountant for the Benguet gold mine, and we lived at the Balatok mine, and I went to the Brent School in Baguio. We had lived in Manila. We went out in 1937, and I was four and a half, and when we got to Manila in 1937. And we worked and lived in Manila for a while, and then in 1940, we left and moved to Baguio. So when I was on the way, it was a Monday morning, and my mother was up early to get me off to school. I had to catch a school bus to go to the Brent School in Baguio City. And the radio was full of the news of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And Mother said, "You're not going to school because Camp John Hay will be next. They will be bombing Baguio next." And she said, "I'm not letting you out." And so we didn't go to school, and indeed Baguio was bombed, as was Clarkfield in Manila. And those who went to school that day, I don't know if you've had a chance to interview Neville, or that's too bad, because Neville was a boarder at Brent School, and they have a story of how they huddled in the chapel and the bombs were falling at Clarkfield next door, and it was traumatic. But in the meantime, for the next few days, as we knew that invasion was imminent. We just had a sense. So we started preparing, and we were holding up food, and we were learning how to do Q-tips and make things, and we were practicing going along the mountains. The Igorots of Baguio were very sure-footed, and there were these little mountain trails to caves, and we were practicing going along this steep incline down to these deep rivers. I was scared to death as we prepared for the long duration of something, God knows what. And finally, in about a week or so of this, we got a call early in the morning that they were evacuating all the women and children from the mines, from the Balatok mines and the Benguet mines, and sending them down to Manila, which was going to be declared an open city, and that we would be safer there because they had actually, what they hadn't quite told us was that they had spotted that the Japanese were landing at Lingayen, and that the invasion was underway. And so they were getting the women and children out on buses. So Mother was told to pack enough for a week or so to be in Manila. And so she packed an evening gown and her tennis racket. And it was just before Christmas. It was really, I think Christmas was a week away, because she had been working with the Igorot carvers and craftspeople to create a dollhouse for me. And this was to be a dollhouse that she was having modeled on a plan she had seen in House Beautiful or something. And she had Igorot silversmiths that had made the little combs and brushes, and she had the furniture carved. And she showed me all this and said, "I'm sorry, we're going to be in Manila for Christmas, so I just want you to see it, and you can play with it when we get back." And of course, we left, and we never got back until 95. We went and waved and looked at the house and went to Baguio. But we were gone. We got to Manila. We stayed with friends. And my father stayed behind with the men to blow up the mines and to bring out some gold bullion and do whatever they could to destroy before the Japanese came. And then his story, which he arrived in Christmas Day, he knocked on the door, this bedraggled man, and he and the men had indeed blown up as much as they could and carried out what, bullion's very heavy, you couldn't carry out much. And the Igorot guides, the Igorot tribe, led them around and out through the mountains, and they would see the Japanese soldiers on a path or a trail, and they would go another way. But when they got to the end of the mountains, and there's sort of an abrupt, the mountains end and then there are the plains, the Igorots were superstitious and would not bring them onto the plane. So they were on their own getting to Manila. Our ride down was really very exciting. Just a minute. Okay. Anyway, his trip down was horrendous. Our trip down on the bus was exciting a number of times because the Japanese were strafing and they were flying overhead. and every now and then our bus would go off to the side to get under some trees so that we wouldn't be seen. And at one point we thought we were safely hidden, and all of a sudden there's this huge explosion, and we're hiding right next to an anti-aircraft, a camouflage anti-aircraft gun that went off, and it just sort of, we left. I do remember that, even though I was just 9 years old. I remember that excitement of that trip to Manila, and of course we were going to visit Auntie Mart and Uncle Bob, and it was great fun. It was all a big adventure. I'm not sure it was such an adventure for my mother, but for a 9-year-old, it was, my goodness, what's happening, what's going to happen next. Anyway, as I said, my father arrived on this bedraggled man on Christmas Day, and then we were going to Manila, though declared an open city, was being bombed by the Japanese. So we would, during the air raids, we would see the planes. They were flying very low. We were up on the top of this apartment building, and we saw the planes. They were eye level. They were coming down and strafing the city. This was not the time of kamikazes. That was much later in World War II, when the Japanese were could see that they were losing, and they had nothing left but take untrained boys and put them in airplanes to kill themselves, to sacrifice themselves. But at that time they were pretty good pilots, and they were strafing and bombing Manila, and we would go down to air raid shelters in the basement, and then the all clear would sound, and we'd go back. Finally that quieted down, and we realized that they were in the city. They had come in their tanks and their trucks, and every Filipino vehicle that they could acquire, and we knew they were there, and it was just a matter of time. And soon the knock came on the door and said, pack enough stuff for 3 days, and take 1 suitcase per person, and we'll round you up. And we were taken to Rizal Stadium, and from there we were assigned to Santo Tomas University, which Santo Tomas was a university north of the Pasig River in Manila, and it was a perfect place for incarceration. It was a walled campus run by, I think Benedictines were the order of the fathers, the brothers that ran the. Also interned with us were a number of Maryknoll nuns, among whom was a very good friend of my mother's, who had nursed me to health. I had been in the hospital very sick at the age of 6. I was in the walled city, Intramuros, and I was in a hospital for a number of months. And this woman is a woman who just recently died a few weeks ago, and she had been in Los Baños and all through camp and back to Los Angeles. She kind of went through our whole lives together, and she was so thrilled that this is nothing to do with Santo Tomas, that I married a Roman Catholic person, because we just kept up forever, as I say. She was a very dear friend, and I was told just before I came here that the 11th Airborne had shown up at her, all those who were still living had shown up at her memorial service back in New York at Maryknoll. So it was Sister Marie Bernard, and she was a wonderful woman. Anyway, we all got to camp, and what was the rest of that question? Have I answered that question? Why I was in the Philippines?
How you found out, and you said the knock came at the door, and you to show up.
Well,
did you see that particular sister in the footage of the rescue from Los Angeles?
No, I didn't. There was a nun. There was a shot of nuns, and it wasn't close enough. You'd have to really freeze the camera to catch that. But there were a group of them. Yes, yes. Well, there were a group of you. You volunteered to go to Los Baños. What happened? Santo Tomas got so crowded that they asked for volunteers, actually, for people to go off and start a new camp.
Did you?
No, we didn't volunteer.
So
we stayed in. We were in Santo Tomas the whole 3 years and 1 month.
Okay. Now, this is about life as a child, but not. Oh, you like to differentiate between babies, children, teenagers, adults, if they make a difference in terms of responsibilities.
Yes. Well, all right. One thing for me that was kind of an event, it made it all a very exciting adventure, even though, as I said, for our parents, it was a much more serious adventure, and certainly one that, they were busy making our life as children as normal as possible. They sacrificed for us for food but going into Santo Tomas, and I was just talking about this morning with a friend of mine, gave me a kind of freedom, because we had a very coddled, watched life. We had amas, we had cooks. We were a part of that imperialist commerce. My father was not in the service. He was in the commercial segment of Manila, and there had been an American presence in the Philippines since the 1900s. So people often ask me, "Oh, was your father in the service?" I said, "No, he was an accountant. He was in business, and there were international harvester that was there. Bankers were there, and these were the civilians that were interned in Santo Tomas, and the people who were rounded up from provinces who were in agriculture, and there were a group of people who were caught, who were entertainers, who had been sent from Shanghai. So there were all kinds of people. It was really a microcosm of the world was caught up, and anyone who was ally. So that there were many Filipinos who were married to Americans, or mestizos or mestizas who were married. There were just all kinds of people in Santo Tomas. It just wasn't one group of people. We had teachers, we had farmers, we had college professors, we had bankers, we had accountants, we had, people who, heavens knows, maybe they were gamblers and prostitutes. We had everything you can imagine. We had entertainers. And these are the people that kind of rounded up. They were executives. They knew what to do, and they got organized. They said, they can't treat us like this. We're going to form a committee. We're going to go to the Japanese and insist that they treat us. And we have to get showers, and we don't want malaria, and we don't want disease, and we're going to get our nurses and doctors organized. And because we had a very nice civilian commandant, and please don't ask me his name because I don't remember, they were allowed to get an organization in place, and it worked. Everybody worked. Everyone over the age of 12 had to do something, and if you're under the age of 12, you had to clean a dustpan, or you had dustpan duty. And someone at this gathering just handed me a monitor room list that her mother had kept, and my name was on it for dustpan duty, and I'd forgotten that. But at the age of 12, you had bathroom duty, and then if you were older, you had to work in gardens, and everybody had a job. My mother became one of the camp's librarians, but she also had to peel potato. Everybody had to do a kitchen duty, but then her other duty was librarian. Also, for me, being an only child with amas and living isolated at a mine and having to be bused to school, I suddenly was in a wonderful ghetto of kids my age. I had an instant family, and I was free of parental viewing. I had a freedom in camp that was unknown to me. I could go as I pleased and do what I want. I had to go to school. Unfortunately, there were also teachers interned, and so school began very quickly. We were all in school, and our schoolrooms were behind buildings, just anywhere, because the classrooms of Santo Tomas were all used for bedrooms. They separated the boys and the dads, and they were, for the most part, in rooms of their own, or eventually another building of their own, and women and small children were all together. And we moved. I don't know, Mother must have just enjoyed moving, because we would go from room to room. I met more people who said, "You were in our room, you were in our room." And I remember living in so many different rooms in camp. The food situation was not as bad at the beginning, because there was access to the outside and markets, and a lot of people from Manila who were very well placed in banks and things, they had access. There, you'll get many, many stories, and some people will talk about how they had their corned beef stashed away. Well, my family didn't have those contacts. A lot of us, even in any situation, there's haves and have-nots, and even in this situation where and I'm speaking of the first year, when we had better food, and we could establish our gardening habits, and we had people on agricultural detail, so to speak, who were planting telinum and various native greens. We got these things in place, and the routine was established, and there was some kind of food and an occasional Red Cross package. The the bad things began to happen with the neglect of the Japanese as they began to lose, and then we got a military commandant, and things got very, very bad because they have no respect for women and children and captured prisoners. They just, it wasn't their culture, and they just kind of hoped we'd go away. I think they didn't know what to do with us, so letting us die of malnutrition seemed pretty easy. Now, a number of people who they suspected of any kind of had any kind of American military record, they weeded those out. They came into camp early on and found any of the husbands and fathers who had been in World War I, had any kind of military record. Somehow they got these, they found these people, and they shipped them out to join the group that had been captured eventually at Bataan, because Bataan, of course, fell later. We were all interned in Santo Tomas when Bataan fell in April, and Corregidor in May, and we remember that. There was actually the fall of Corregidor coincided with an earthquake, and yes, there are earthquakes in the Philippines too. The tower of Santo Tomas, the cross on the tower was shaken. It was a little crooked from that point on, and somehow in my mind the fall of the crookedness of the Tower of Santo Tomas has always been connected to the fall of Corregidor. There was also a group that was repatriated after about a year and a half, and I believe the Maidens, Carl Maidens and Shelley Maidens, were returned on that. And then when well, that's another story about Carl Maidens. Is there something else that I should be focusing on?
You've already talked about jobs in the camp, and
school,
about food, and something about school.
Well, the food got very, there was no food at the end.
School, different.
Well, school was marvelous. The teachers were excellent. They were outstanding. Actually, they were the teachers who had been teaching in the American schools in Manila. I guess there were 3 schools. There was the American school, there was Bordner's school, and there was Central. And all these teachers were caught. We had entertainment, as I started to say, because of this visiting troupe of entertainers who were traveling the circuit of the Pacific. And we, at the beginning, even our commandants and their generals came to visit. You know, they would, but of course, all that stopped. You know, we had curfew, and we weren't allowed entertainment, and we began to starve. And school really, by the last I would say the last part of 1944. I don't know the dates exactly. Someone could tell you that information is available. They finally had to stop the school. There wasn't anyone strong enough to go. I had stopped going. I was just too weak to climb the stairs. By that time, they had been using the chemistry labs up on the top of the university for classrooms, and I was then at 7th grade. I had started off in 4th grade behind a building out under a tree. We had no textbooks. Well, we had textbooks that we could use the way you would check something out and read it and then return it. We were allowed to do that. And when we did get textbooks, the Japanese had very carefully gone through and crossed out every dollar sign and just eliminated all evidence of American symbols for anything. And I'm not sure whether they were using pesos. They had a money. They issued a money that we called Mickey Mouse. It was a paper money. It was worthless, and it was neither peso nor dollar. So we did have some books, but the teachers just taught. They used the blackboard. They assigned things. They taught without textbooks. There were textbooks for math and things, and it was wonderful. I remember vividly learning a lot. In fact, when I came back to Los Angeles, though I had missed most of 7th grade, probably all of it. I can't do a percentage to this day because I think that's when I was supposed to have gotten it. I went right into 8th grade. In fact, it was kind of interesting. I went to a Thomas Starr King Junior High, and it was 1st grade of school. Mother had prepared the girls' vice principal, Miss Trowbridge. I was wisely put into a homeroom with Miss Lilienthal, and on the first day of school, she introduced, I want you all to welcome KERNS, who has come back from interned by the Japanese in Manila, and she was in a Japanese prison camp throughout World War II. Clap, 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 clap. And now I would like you to meet Mariko Nagumo, and she has returned from from an American prison camp in Wyoming or wherever. And we clap, clap, clap. It meant nothing to me, and I'm sure I don't know what it meant to Mariko, because we were now 13, and years later, I thought, oh, the wisdom of that Miss Trowbridge to put us both in this homeroom. Not that it really meant anything to anybody, or maybe it did more than I realized. I don't know.
Were you ever afraid that the Japanese were going to hurt you, or did they?
Oh, we knew they were going to do that if we didn't behave. All right. The question you asked, if we were ever afraid that the Japanese would hurt us, we were told the Japanese would hurt us if we didn't bow, and we tried to just stay away from them. We were younger. The stories of people who were 4 years older, the teenage boys who would deliberately instigate trouble to tease the Japanese soldiers, are much, much different. I have heard since, talking to teenagers, how they would throw cans, or they would run around, or they would try to incite the Japanese to do something. We, at the age of 9 and 10, behaved. We stayed away from them, as I did, and though we carried on in camp and went to the tall grass and took risks, never anything that we thought would put us in any danger. Though friends of mine have been slapped for forgetting to bow. I was not. I avoided them, and I bowed. At one point when we had shanties, we were allowed to live outside of our rooms. We always lived in our room, but we had a cooking shanty because, again, of the population. They kept bringing people in from provinces and putting more and more people. As they rounded up Allied Brits and Americans and Dutch, and they'd bring them into Santo Tomas, which is why they had to eventually open up Los Baños. We were allowed to build little shanties on the campus grounds in certain little shanty towns, and many lived in their shanties, or we could at least be in the shanties during the day. We had to be back in our room at night, depending on what we wanted to do. And so that was, that question? I was starting to talk about something. Oh, there's a noise in the background. The shanties. Oh, see, you're very much more aware of that. Yes. Yes.
People's voices, you understand.
There's still a clip. Why don't we just shut the door? What is it?
Like that. He's just putting nickels, dimes, and pennies in the cash register. I asked him if he could just do it for 5 minutes, obviously.
Yeah.
He has to do it. So we'll just
wait. I know what I was going to finish.
My talk right is wonderful the way you said. We were told they would hurt us. Worry about your parents.
All right, just let me finish. I was just winding up that one thing. Oh, he's done. We were in our shanty, so we washed our hair in outdoor showers, cold water, with something called go-go bark. Go-go bark is not, we didn't have soaps. So go-go bark is a bark from some plant, and it gets sudsy, and one can wash. It's, in fact, the Filipinas who were interned, the mestizos, knew all about it, and their glowing hair. So I remember going with my bucket of sudsy go-go bark to go wash myself and my hair in this outdoor shower near my shanty, and I remember running into a guard, and I also remember that all I had to do was bow and say benjo, which means toilet, and it was pretty obvious that that's where I was going, so I bowed and said benjo, and he bowed, and I went on my way. And mostly speaking for myself, did everything I could to stay away from the guards because I knew they had slapped people and beaten people. There were many, many stories of people who were taken down to the front gate where they had their compound and made to stare at the sun all day, and they were brutal. And at one point my father had been put in jail because he was on garbage duty, and garbage duty was a wonderful duty to get on because you had an opportunity to smuggle food into camp, and it was the way things. One of the ways that food and notes and things got in and out of camp, when they went out with the garbage and came in with whatever, and the empty cans. So he had gotten caught smuggling in some cocoa honey and some stuff and food for us, and got caught, and he was put in the camp jail for 2 or 3 weeks, or maybe it was a month. Others remember that his being in jail. And of course, the jail was a room, you know, with a hole, with a pan, and that was it. And you were there for weeks or a month or more for your punishment. But you could go by a window on the outside and say, "Hi, Brian. Hi, how are you?" or something like that. So we remember that. And my parents were, they were not allowed to live together, and they decided not to have a sleeping shanty. They couldn't afford it. You know, as I say, some people could afford really big shanties, and some people could have just little cooking huts. So we had a little cooking hut they were together during the day, and at night they went their separate ways. There were many children born in camp eventually, because families did start to live together again. And the question, what was the question about my parents?
Did you worry that they would hurt your parents?
I didn't worry about that. I mean, the fact that they jailed my dad, but they didn't torture him, but he was not suspected of spying. Any time they could suspect somebody of doing he was caught with food. He wasn't caught with messages. If you got caught, and there were daring do stories of younger men with lots of testosterone who'd go over the fence and come back, you know, within a night, or somehow get from curfew to curfew, would be out dealing with smuggling, getting things to Cabanatuan, eyeglasses and that sort of thing. There's lots of good stories, but those were older people. As I say, I was 9, 10, 11, and 12.
What was a typical breakfast, a typical lunch, a typical dinner?
The food that we ate, well, we had, toward the end, because at the beginning we had fruit. We could have mangoes and lasagna. We all learned. I remember before the war that we ate grapes and we ate apples. Somehow the stores imported this stuff. And then I remembered that as we became internees, we learned to eat native food and love it. And we ate santols, which is a fruit, and lanzonis, and chicos, which is brown and sugary, and atis, and things that I don't remember eating as a child before we were interned. And so the Americans and the British discovered the Filipino cuisine and learned to cook babinkas and eat puto, which is a rice thing, and we became so fond of it because this is what we enjoyed the first year and a half, and then this is what we missed towards the end when we couldn't even get that, and we had learned so to love the rice cakes and the puto and the babinkas and the things. We were digging up banana trees because the root of the banana tree, of course that was short-sighted, you never get a banana that way, but nothing lasted that long, and there were no pets in camp, I might add. There wasn't one pet that I know of that lasted throughout those 3 years. One family, Martin Bob Roberts, with whom we had stayed in Manila when we came down from Baguio, brought their beloved big gray Persian cat into camp and had a cage, but I'm not sure he lasted forever. It seems once he disappeared, he finally disappeared too. But we didn't, the food at the end, let's see, what did we have for breakfast at the end? Well, we'd have a little gruely rice, which wasn't, it wasn't that nourishing, the rice alone, without beans. Sometimes we'd get soybeans, which were wonderful and we'd savor them. I remember we wouldn't get lunch. We'd get something like lugao. They called it lugao. We'd get this gruel again at night. If we ever could get soybeans, I would suck them and make them last as long as I could. I actually sucked stones. I used to go out and get stones. They tasted so good. You know, they talk about people eating dirt. It must have needed the mineral content of something, of dirt and stones, because I remember one of my greatest pleasure was just sucking a warm stone and it tasted good. There was a sense of dirt and mineral on it. Maybe I was getting something from that. I didn't make stone soup, but I did.
Do you remember how you felt after the American soldiers arrived, and they must have brought food with them?
No, when the night when we were liberated, this was a big surprise to everybody. Certainly the American Army had not planned this liberation. They had just finally sent 2 columns down and pitted them against each other and said, whoever gets to Manila first, start liberating these camps. And this is for other historians to sort this out, and we've heard the story a number of times from all our liberators, but they came down in 2 columns, and I guess it was the 14th Battalion. One of them got to the camp, and we were on the front. It was 9 o'clock at night. It was February 3rd, and we had gone to bed, and there was curfew and blackout and all this stuff, and we heard this commotion at the gate. And it was a tank battering down the gate, and we didn't, finally it dawned on us that when we saw this light, it was going very slowly, that this indeed was what it was. And we yelled, come on, it's not mined. And we had, in the meantime, I wondered where the Japanese had gone, because there was just no sign of Japanese anywhere. And so as soon as we were sure it was an American tank, we streamed out of the building. Those of us were on the front of the main building. They were coming down the road on the right as they came through the gate. And we streamed out, and they were very upset. They said, get back, you know. And this Carl Meidens, I start to mention that repatriated were Shelley and Carl Meidens. And Carl Meidens came into camp with those big yellow tall soldiers, and my mother just threw her arms around, Carl Meidens, oh, you're back. It was so great. So this was an amazing moment. We couldn't be contained. We were so excited. And all they were trying to do was get us back into the building and go find where the Japanese were and get them. And there we were, you know, thinking we were completely liberated and free. We were. We were the only place in Manila where there was any American presence whatsoever. The entire city of Manila was still held by the Japanese. So we were in a very dangerous situation. They went over, they realized that the Japanese were holed up in the Ed building next door, which is where my father was. And they had taken my father and the men and the boys as hostages. They were up on the 2nd floor using the men and boys as hostages. And we told Americans, because they were lined up ready to let go and give it their guns were pointed on the Ed building. They were ready to get them all out. And we said, no, there are men and boys in there, and they're being used as hostages. But they did indeed shoot. They at the lower floors, and many who had survived, had gotten to this liberation in this process, tied sheets together to escape out the back, and they were too weak to hold on and fell to their deaths. And it was very sad. My dad was telling, and he said a Japanese came in and pushed him down to use him and to shoot out the window, to shoot back. And so that was a very bad time. And this was the situation. So no, they did not bring food with them. They were not there with a lot of food. There was nothing. And the food, it took some days for the supplies to catch up with this group that had come in. In fact, it was the 1st Cavalry that came after them to kind of take over. And then this group that had liberated us, and then Bilibid, went on to fight the Battle of Manila. They were doing their job. They weren't there to feed us or do anything like that. They were just there to get the camp, get a foothold, save us, because they had learned that we were going to be killed. And the Japanese didn't want to deal with a bunch of civilian prisoners. Well, they were retreating, and that we were not going to be around. They were going to take the able-bodied men for hostages, if there were no one able-bodied, and just get rid of all the women and children and old people and then sick people. So we were saved, and but we were not fed. There were supplies. I guess there were beans. There were lots and lots of beans, canned beans and things. So we ate that, and the shelling had started. In a few days, they had gotten a beat on the camp, and the shelling of Santo Tomas started right after MacArthur left, as a matter of fact, from the unfolding of the flag and the MacArthur's return. And at that point, they hit some water supplies. So there was no way to flush toilets or be in the building, and we were eating this. We were not used to eating food. It was too rich or something. We all had diarrhea, terrible, terrible diarrhea, and the shelling was underway, and we were on the far corner outside the building, farthest away from the direction of Manila. And the shelling was hitting one part of the main building, and we were on the opposite corner of that, and we could go and crawl into the window of one bathroom. And as I say, the toilets didn't flush. We had to have water buckets, and everything stopped working. So the food, I don't remember having very much food. The GIs shared their hardtack and chocolate with us, but we never had. I guess just we were the first group out. We were on a lottery, and we flew out on February 22nd. We were liberated on February 3rd, and by February 22nd, we were on a truck. You saw the picture. We were on a truck on our way to that plane that was flying to Leyte to take care of us. So I do remember being served some real food from a kitchen that was set up before we left, but that really took a while. They did not come in with food. They came in with their own, whatever GIs carried with them to feed themselves, and then whatever supplies there were in the larder somewhere stashed by the Japanese or somebody for something, we got, and it was we just couldn't handle it. And then combination with the shelling and the water breaking down and all that. So no, but there was chocolate, certainly, and there were GIs. There's another story, because if I had stayed longer, I would have the other stories of the food and the GIs taking them all around. You should have just taken the camera and gone on that. No, that's all right. We should have turned the camera on to that.
It's delightful.
We could have just, had a great little intermission there. All right. We were the first lot. My mother, I think she was wheeling and dealing or trying her best. She wanted to get back, and I remember she kept saying, "My parents in Montana, you haven't seen." She was pulling her wonderful thing, and we got on that first truck and we went out there. Of course, Manila was still held by the Japanese. There were 2 prisons that were held by the Americans, and as we were getting on the trucks, not seen in that tape, the Battle of Manila was beginning, and on the horizon to the west you could see fires and the beginning of this awful Battle of Manila. Of course, I had no idea that was going on. All my mother and my family was focused on was getting out and getting home and getting away from this place, because though I may have enjoyed much of the maybe 2 of the 3 years, it was hell for my parents, and all they wanted to do was get away from this terrible experience that they had gone through. And we went out of town to a road. It looked in the film as though it was a strip, but really it was just roads. There were no airports. None of the airfields had been captured by the Americans, so they could only fly out on back roads. And the first plane we got into went into a pothole and lost a tire. So we had to get out of that plane, and at that point my mother was having conniption fits and said, absolutely, I'm not going back to that camp. So they had another little lottery, but somehow we got on the smaller plane with the Lewis family and quite a few others, and we sat in bucket seats and we flew out, they say it was February 22nd. My son has done some research on it, and he was pointing out that he thought it was February 23rd, which was when Laguna, that they were sailing the amphibians across Laguna de Bay after having rescued Los Baños. Because Los Baños, as we were flying out, the first group to get out of Santo Tomas, they were in the process of liberating Los Baños Internment Camp. We got to Leyte in the middle of the night. It was dark. It was light as we left. It must have been 5-ish. It was sunset. Actually, it was as we left the camp. We got there, and they didn't know what to do with us. They had no idea that all these civilians were going to be landing on them in Leyte. And we drove in trucks again from one end of Leyte to the other while they were trying to figure out where they were going to put all of us. And finally, they decided to put us in this recovery, convalescence camp where there were nurses things. So we went back and forth until we got to someplace on the beach to the east on the Pacific side, a camp, and it was wonderful. That's when we got the good food. Then suddenly there was something like chipped beef, corned beef. Everybody laughs about the, but we thought it was wonderful. What's this? Chipped beef on toast? That was great stuff. And as a matter of fact, I think my mother served it once a week for the rest of her life. It was so good. So then we were in Leyte for some time, at least a week, and at that point our life as an American teenager must have begun, because the young soldiers were just thrilled to see even little girls of 12 and a half and 13 look good. So we were the center of attention. And I had 3 years of being kind of away from, I was with Mother, but I was not under her eye all the time. So Anne Lewis Conroy and I were having a great time on Leyte. And then we were put on ships, and we had to go on, we were on the SS Jean Lafitte, which was a merchant marine ship that had changed, not exactly a hospital ship, but lots of shell-shocked veterans and soldiers were going back on that. And we went back way south. We had to go south of the equator down to the Admiralties, down to New Guinea. We could not sail across the Pacific. They hadn't even taken Iwo Jima. The battles, this was so early when you think of how much more they had to take and fight, and that there was such a long haul. We thought that was the end of the war. Well, it was for us, but it wasn't for anyone else. There was mines and islands, so we went way south to the Admiralties, and then went north and came up to San Francisco and sailed into San Francisco.
Now, when you were back in school, and you did comment on this, actually your story probably is as good as it gets in terms of feeling different.
Yes,
But you said you were introduced.
Yes.
As someone who had been in
I looked forward to, I think my internment camp experience, having been with so many kids, having been in a ghetto, truly, because we were just all living on top of each other. My space was this big in a room, in a classroom filled with beds. From 25 to 30, however many cots you could put in a room with aisle space between them. We had nothing, so you could put stuff under your bed, have a little bunch of shelves, and that's all you needed. But I had lived like that, so I was perfectly comfortable dealing with hordes of people, which I would not have been if the war had not happened and I had continued at Brent School and graduated and probably gone back to Mills or something, because I was going to be an art major, and it would have been an entirely different life. My life changed. I was suddenly a little ghetto kid running around in rags and starving with hundreds of friends or people my age in the same boat, and it was marvelous because I didn't think that it was unusual. My parents were deprived. I was liberated, so to speak.